Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our third appointment of the Digital Classicist London Seminar Series. And today our speakers are Arlo Griffiths from the French School of Asian Studies in Paris, and Dániel Balogh from Humboldt-University, Berlin. And Arlo and Dániel will tell us everything about Project DHARMA, pushing South and Southeast Asian textual sources into the digital world. And it is my great pleasure to give the floor to Arlo and to welcome them to our seminar.
Thank you very much. In today's presentation, we'll be discussing the ERC-funded project DHARMA, and maybe we can now move to the first slide, which is coming up.
I seem to be having a problem with Google Slides. Instead of starting, it just says loading.
That's actually perfect, because it gives me the opportunity to remind to everyone that is watching this seminar on YouTube that after the seminar, after our speakers will be done talking, you're very welcome to ask questions that will be read to our speakers in real time. So feel free to contribute to the conversation and to write your comments or to start asking questions using the chat on YouTube. I see that the slides are now up and running. So back to you, Arlo.
Thank you. So there we are. The DHARMA project is about a large chunk of Asia, which we shall refer to as South and Southeast Asia, and covers particularly some of the zones indicated here. Zone A at the bottom left, so right near Pondicherry, being the Tamil-speaking south of India. Zone B consisting in two subzones, being South Asia from the Deccan, that's sort of at the left, to Arakan, that's in present Myanmar, also known as Rakhine, and Zone C, Southeast Asia, with special focus on the islands of Sumatra and Java in Indonesia, and the ancient territories of Cambodia and Champa, which correspond to Thailand, Laos, Vietnam, and Cambodia today. The research questions of the project concern the institutionalization of Hinduism in quotation marks, because actually we're also talking about Buddhism and even some other associated religions, approached from various angles. Material culture, top right, aspects such as archaeology and iconography, through study of specific sites, such as temples and archaeological excavations, ashramas, that's a type of monastic institution, archaeologically tested in Cambodia, site and a site Bumiayu in Sumatra. We're studying questions of patronage of such, of religious institutions, monastic institutions, ascetic institutions, mainly on the basis of epigraphy in these various regions that I've just indicated. But we're also looking at prescriptive representations, mainly preserved in manuscripts from South and Southeast Asia, whether literary on the right-hand side, so literary allusions to religious institutions in languages such as Sanskrit, Tamil, or Old Javanese, and also on the left-hand side, other kinds of descriptions of such institutions. Yes, so the acronym DHARMA is a somewhat creative manipulation of the full title, The Domestication of Hindu Asceticism and the Religious Making of South and Southeast Asia. In this project, as I've already started hinting at, we're trying to transcend various kinds of boundaries, namely boundaries between corpora in the very central cosmopolitan language Sanskrit and in a rather wide range of vernacular languages, often present-day national languages, as in the case of Khmer, or let's say regional languages, as in the case of Tamil and Javanese, which are not national languages of India and Indonesia respectively, but have very respectable literary or written traditions. Also boundaries between the study of inscriptions and so-called texts. Actually, we avoid that term texts entirely in our internal terminology and oppose non-transmitted texts, that is inscriptions, to transmitted texts, that is texts. Also boundaries between South and Southeast Asia, which were very much connected worlds through much of history and have been become separated more by contemporary global political categories than they were in the past. And also boundaries between national, in our case, Asian scholarship, and the scholarship that we ourselves represent from Europe and other parts of the non-Asian world. The project focuses on worldly aspects of foundations to ascetic and monastic institutions, wishing to counterbalance a certain focus on the otherworldly aspects, the philosophical aspects of Indian religions that are rather overrepresented in international scholarship. And to these aims, we wish to harness written sources, as I've said, inscriptions, manuscripts, through a digital quantum leap. And it's, of course, this digital quantum leap that we're going to talk about today. And we're trying to do this work through 3 teams in Europe, that is in Paris, in Berlin, and in Naples, but also benefiting from several field stations in India, Bangladesh, Cambodia, and Indonesia, with in total a team of more than 25 epigraphists and philologists, most of them actively involved in digital editing in the TEI framework, 5 archaeologists, and 2 data managers.
Okay. Yeah. You now have the big picture from Arlo, and I'll try to talk about some of the small details, getting down to some dirty particulars. But before we do that, I want to give just a very quick overview of where we are as regards South and Southeast Asian studies and digital texts and digital information storage in general. It has repeatedly been said, not always benevolently, that Indian studies or Asian studies are lagging 100 years behind Greco-Roman studies or classical studies. And there is, of course, a lot of truth in that. The main truth behind this statement is that in a general cataloging and high-quality publishing of primary sources, we are very far behind. Various colonial regimes did make an issue of documenting, editing, publishing as many available sources as possible, but that does not mean that this has been as exhaustive as it has been in, for example, the Mediterranean world. So there is plenty of groundwork for us that needs to be done or that needs to be redone. There are, of course, also good things about being 100 years behind classical studies. One of the good things is that I have the feeling that we more often get to be sort of pioneers than people in Greco-Roman studies. And of course, another good thing is that we can piggyback on things that have been developed by you guys, starting from the principles of critical editing of text, and down to modern methodology such as TEI and epidoc, and various ways of managing and dealing with non-textual data. But the big problem arising from this is that whatever we do, I mean, of course, we don't want to, be content with meticulously editing and re-editing stuff and just publishing what we can find, but we would also like to do some in-depth research. But we can't really do that without also staying perhaps more closely in touch with the ground. We need to both expand, in a sense that I like to call horizontal, the magnitude or the scope, the horizontal width of the data set available to us, and we need to increase the depth, sort of grow our corpus, grow our data vertically by increasing the quality of the data we have, among other things, by adding, for example, a digital markup to our text editions, which is my main focus at this point. So one way of seeing what I've been talking about is that we have the world out there, we generate knowledge from the world out there, i.e. from original artifacts, such as archaeological objects, but in this particular case that I now have at the forefront, text-bearing objects, such as manuscripts and inscriptions. From this, we generate knowledge by study, but this knowledge needs to be made accessible through publication. In recent times, mere paper publication is insufficient because electronic data offers a much better accessibility to this data and thus much easier research. And even best, or even better, is to have clean and structured data encoded in various standardized ways that allow these data to be easily processed by machine, and thus accessibility gets even better, and even several new kinds of research questions become possible, or at least research questions that would have taken years to answer 10 years ago or 100 years ago can now be answered in a matter of days. But of course, there are problems every step of the way. So in this production of let's say, hierarchically improved data, there are difficulties at every step, beginning with the world out there, where text-bearing objects are sometimes located in remote places, and very often in open air, often with protection by a local archaeological authority, but sometimes without any protection, and exposed completely both to weather. Sometimes it is damaged without intending damage by people who, for example, smear objects with oil as an act of worship. And there is, of course, also deliberate vandalism and illegitimate trade in artifacts. So here is an example from India of a little temple bearing an inscription. You probably can't see, but the image magnified on the bottom left is actually an inscription. Most of it is gone. It's never been edited. It's not even known to most people. It was shown to me by a local person who had a very good knowledge of antiquities in the area. And that's it. No preservation. Likewise, even when things are preserved, sometimes custody, restoration, preservation is careless. Restoration may be very clumsy, intending to sort of restore an item, for example, to the shape, as you can see in the Indonesian example, restore an item to the shape that it might have been in, without paying particular attention to the inscription that might have been on it. And of course, I have already mentioned illicit trade, small portable inscriptions, such as those on small statues, and the special Indian and Southeast Asian kind of inscription, the copper plate tablet, is very susceptible to just, being sold on the black market to collectors. And it's also very susceptible to just being lost, perhaps through simple negligence, from museum storehouses. Where often things are not really well catalogued, and all of us, I think, have spent time trying to track down an object that was recorded in 1930 to have been entered the stores of such and such a museum, but nobody knows where it is now. As regards the publication of existing data, we are situated pretty well as far as the earlier material up to perhaps the end of the first millennium by the Common Era is concerned. It's quite extensively published. For the later material, it varies. Certain regional corpora or other like areas of interest are extensively published, but there's a lot of modern, or well, not modern, recent inscriptions that have not been published. Throughout the published inscriptions, the standard of publication is quite varying, and alas, the standard of facsimile publication also varies quite a lot. In this respect, actually, the earliest publications are best because they used very labor-intensive printing techniques to create excellent replicas of ink drubbings of inscriptions. But very often they were incomplete, and especially in modern times, they are very often like just a tiny thing squeezed onto like 3 of them to an A4 page and printed in very low quality offset, which is practically illegible. And also very often recent reproductions are not actually ink estampages, but simply photographs, which are not very useful to begin with. Again, much of the best work was done by very early scholars who were fantastic. I can't stop admiring the way they diligently processed their stuff and retained in their minds, without access to any database or even a searchable electronic text, an incredible amount of knowledge, but still they just didn't have access to as much knowledge as we now have at our fingertips. Very often they didn't know as much about the historical context or about the inscriptional terminology as we do now, and also their priorities were a little bit different from that of those of modern day historians. They were primarily concerned with chronology and dynastic history, and very often they would just say, well, this inscription contains nothing of historical interest, even though it might be, tremendously interesting for social history or for the sort of questions that Dharma is trying to address, but it just simply doesn't say, who the father and grandfather of the ruling king was. And likewise, they did not pay as much attention as we now prefer to the archaeological context in which inscriptions were found, and to the artifacts as objects themselves. I'll just breeze through the rest of the stages because they're not very interesting. We have, of course, electronic data available now, both in the form of scanned publications, which are, of course, not eminently useful, as well as in the form of various electronic texts that are searchable. I don't need details of these. The problem is with all kinds of electronic texts, the main problem is that as far as markup is concerned, there isn't really a universal standard that might be applied. A lot of electronic texts are available without any kind of markup. Many are available with basic text-based markup, such as brackets and asterisks and numbers added into the text. And of course, there's also a gradually increasing body of text marked up in XML, usually TEI compliant, but I think there are also some custom XML methods used, and this corpus is growing all the time. Now, specifically for epigraphy, the effort to build up electronic data in epigraphy of South Asian and Southeast Asian studies is quite new. The earliest pioneer that I know of was this gentleman, Dmitry Yeluchin, who created a very sizable corpus of published electronic texts of various Indian inscriptions without any kind of markup before the times of Unicode. So it's something that today is more like a curiosity, and he deserves kudos as a pioneer. But his work is no longer usable in the form that it was first created. There have been several projects that created corpora of manageable size, consisting in targeted sets of inscriptions marked up in TEI and epidoc. And as some of you know, there has been the recent project also funded by the European Research Council called Beyond Boundaries. And within Beyond Boundaries, we attempted to create a larger epigraphic corpus marked up in epidoc, which was called SIDDHARM. But this was not a complete success. SIDDHARM is still alive and it's still being expanded, but the focus is not so much on the marked up texts and even less on the careful re-edition of texts. And basically what SIDDHARM is now mostly becoming is a sort of meta-index for any kinds of electronic resources that are available and that are related to South Asian, mainly South Asian epigraphic sources. So what are we trying to do in Dharma? Well, of course, if SIDDHARM was overambitious, we may also be overambitious. Our project description promises about 5,000 encoded inscriptions, which come from approximately 10 different languages using a wide variety of scripts. All of these are related, and I'll come back to that. These text-bearing objects come from 10 present-day nation states, and one of these is in a state of what you might call civil war now. And to complicate the matter further, as you can see, scholarly literature concerning these inscriptions is written in widely varying languages and is based on somewhat different scholarly traditions depending on which colonial regime the pioneers of that branch of scholarship belonged to. So how can we address all this variety? And here I'm especially interested in the question, can we develop a transliteration standard and an encoding standard that can sort of remain at least somewhat homogeneous throughout this extremely varied corpus in Dharma, and yet that can cover all this variety. So of course we want our coverage to be as broad as possible. We want to create new electronic data by processing published data. We also want to create new knowledge by editing texts that have not been unpublished, that have not been published before. But we also want our data to be good quality. We want to re-edit previously published texts and hopefully at a higher standard than at which they have been edited before. And we want to enrich existing editions even when we don't re-edit stuff, for example, by adding semantic tagging. So we need to find a sort of point of balance between creating as broad a corpus as possible, but also making it as useful for research as possible and keeping resources for doing some actual research beyond building up this corpus. So the first issue that I'd like to talk about in detail is the question of transliteration. On that point, I should note that very often the term transcription is used for when you write down what you see in an inscription. We prefer to avoid transcription in that sense and use it just in the sense of phonological transcription. And when we write down the text of an inscription, we transliterate it. We don't use the original alphabet, but usually a Latin-based transliteration. In Indological publishing, and I believe also in Southeast Asian scholarship, it is in some circles customary to use a modern script of a related language for publishing inscriptions, such as publishing Sanskrit texts, not just inscriptions, but any kinds of Sanskrit texts in the Devanagari script of modern North India. But there are plenty of reasons why we can prefer Romanized transliteration of our text. First of all, we are entitled or empowered to do that by the fact that there is no such thing as a native script for Sanskrit. There's no such thing as the Sanskrit alphabet. Sanskrit has been written in numerous alphabets through its history. There is also no Unicode and no available fonts for most of the pre-modern scripts that we work with. It's much easier to type in Romanized transliteration. Romanized transliteration allows us to place our markup and editorial spacing in a finer way than the original script would allow us. And it also paves the way for wider accessibility, because there aren't a lot of people around who read many native scripts. So, okay, I could read the Sanskrit edition in Devanagari, but I would definitely not be able, for example, to read the text of a Khmer inscription printed in modern Khmer. And I might be interested in reading the text even if I don't speak the language. So Romanized transliteration is good, although it has some drawbacks. Perhaps the biggest drawback is that many modern Asian scholars prefer to work in a local alphabet and are not used to working in transliteration. But that, of course, brings along the problem that they must remain focused on their own narrower area. To understand what we propose in transliteration, we need to talk a little bit about the kind of scripts that we use, that our material uses, but I'll try to keep that very brief in order to leave Arlo some more time to talk about the bigger things. So I'll be summarizing the next couple of slides very quickly. The point is that there exist various romanization standards for South and Southeast Asian languages, mostly for Sanskrit. There's also an ISO standard which covers 10 modern scripts or script and language combinations from South Asia, but not from Southeast Asia. But there are certain features of the script that the ISO standard does not replicate. Because it's sort of in between transliteration and transcription in the linguistic sense. It's not so much interested in preserving what was written and how was written, but more in preserving the text as an abstract manifestation of thought, and not the text as it was written down on a particular carrier. And we, as people who work with epigraphic data, would like to preserve a little more detail about what's actually on the stone or on the copper plate. So I have probably used the term Indic script before. All our scripts are describable as Indic scripts or Brahmic scripts, which means that they are descendants of an ancient script in modern days called Brahmi. We are not sure whether that was an original name for that script, and which is the ancestor not only of all, well, practically all, there are of course also various kinds of Arabic script used in modern India, but of all the Indian origin scripts used in modern India. And beyond modern India, Brahmi is also the ancestor of the scripts of Southeast Asia. The main feature of this script is that it's a so-called Abugida alphabet. It uses signs which normally represent a consonant with an inherent short vowel, which is up in the case of Sanskrit. And if you want the script to represent a syllable with a different vowel, then you add various signs, which you might see as diacritical signs, to the basic sign to change, for example, ka into ka, or ki, or ku, and so on. I'll skip most of the detail here. This is the important thing that those who are not familiar with Indic scripts need to keep in mind, that it's basically a syllabic script in which there is always a vowel associated with a consonant, and the vowel may be marked, in which case it is not up, or it may be unmarked, in which case it is up. So sorry, I'll just breeze through a couple of things here. Here we get to a couple of interesting things. So the script is, of course, eminently suited for writing down basic open syllables that consist of a single consonant and a single vowel. but not all the languages for which this script is used have syllables of this structure predominantly. Sanskrit doesn't, and most Southeast Asian languages don't. So you need to develop ways, for example, to indicate a final consonant. One way to write down a syllable ending in a consonant in this script is to invent a new sign, which you add to the sign, which would normally represent a consonant and a short vowel. So on the screen, you see the modern Devanagari script for aham, which has the letter for m plus a modifier sign, which means you don't pronounce the vowel. Now, if you use, for example, ISO transliteration, you would simply transliterate this text as aham, but in Dharma, we want to explicitly represent in our transliteration this vowel killer sign, in this case by the median dot attached to the transliteration. Another way to represent closed syllables, especially, and not just closed syllables, but syllables beginning with multiple consonants, is to combine signs into what is known in literature and Indic script as a ligature. So it's not really the same thing as a ligature in the Latin writing tradition, but we call these conjunct consonants ligatures. It means that if you combine the forms of two basic consonants, then the one that occupies the primary position does not have its vowel pronounced. So in the picture you see on the screen, we have Sakya Muni, where Kya is composed of the cross for Ka at the top, and this sort of number 3 lying on its side for Ya at the bottom, and instead of Ka Ya, it's Kya. So that's the sort of default way of writing down more than one consonant next to each other. And a third way of writing final consonants is to invent special signs which signify consonants without an inherent vowel, as in the example which shows you the word shatam, and you can see that M, the consonant M, is a special sign, quite distinct, although obviously derived from the regular sign from ma at the bottom. Again, this kind of writing would not be distinguished in standard transliteration from any other way of writing down shatam, but in Dharma we are interested in keeping that distinction because it's paleographically important what a particular inscription does, or even what an inscription does at a particular spot. For example, in my experience in Indian inscriptions, these special final consonant signs are preferred to any other way when there's also a semantic boundary here. So they also serve as a kind of punctuation. Okay, again, I'll just skip a couple of details here and go on to some questions of encoding our texts. So, as I have hinted, we are using TEI and in particular epidoc, but even though epidoc is already a narrowing down of possibilities afforded by TEI, we still need to narrow down the possibilities of epidoc to some extent in order to make our material more homogeneous within the project. And we also need to devise some new solutions compliant with epidoc and TEI for special features of our material which does not really occur in Mediterranean epigraphy. One of the special things we often need to deal with is the copperplate inscription that I have already mentioned. These kind of inscriptions, they are of course only inscriptions in a very limited sense because they were not meant to be publicly exhibited. They are more like private documents intended to remain in perpetuity, but are traditionally studied by epigraphic methods and published by in epigraphic contexts. So these are very often, actually almost all the time, grants of land or some other means of income to religious institutions, and thus they form a very core object of attention for Project Dharma. but they come with their own set of special requirements where we need to set up a format in which all copper plates can hopefully be encoded following the same structure of an epidoc document, including you can't really see on the image, but there's an inscription usually on this seal attached to the ring which binds the copper plates together, and then you get a number of plates which may be inscribed on one or both sides. So we've got standardized ways of how we handle that kind of structure. We also need to devise ways to handle the special script features that I have been talking about. One of these features, I will probably not go into any more detail about the other ones, but one that may be relevant to people who are used to epidoc is that since we edit our text in transliteration, we have to be careful because when, for example, in the image, the character ma is changed into the character ma by the original scribe or engraver, what he does is he puts an extra stroke on the top right of the character ma. Now suppose that the scribe omitted that stroke, so it's a scribal omission if we're looking at it technically. He forgot to inscribe the stroke that turns ma into ma. But what we are doing when we correct that omission is not supplying an a, because without that stroke for a, what we have on the actual plate or stone is ma. So we are correcting, as editors, we are correcting ma into ma rather than reading just m and supplying a. And the same applies the other way around. So we have to pay attention to these sorts of difficulties that arise both from the nature of the original script and from the fact that we edit them in transliteration. Although if we edited them in a native script which followed the same logic, which was also an Abugida script, then we would also have to face a difficult situation, because either we would have to mutilate Unicode representation and use the vowel markers without a consonant support, which Unicode was not meant to do, or we would have to correct, just as in the transliteration, we would have to use editorial correction, but we would have to do that on the entire combination ma and ma instead of just on the vowel, which is more precisely placed in transliteration. There are also a number of other and more exotic features that we have had to at least attempt to devise solutions for. And beyond the actual addition and encoding of stuff, we are also trying to develop good practice for certain other features of the script, such as, for example, working towards a typology of the non-alphanumeric signs, such as punctuation and auspicious marks or fortune-bringing marks used in the text. Now, beyond that, we've had to also work on methods of how we improve, how we add value to the text. Probably no need to go into too much detail. What's particularly interesting here is that we want to devise a way of encoding the script that is used in a particular inscription, and especially the script that is used at any particular locus in a multi-script inscription. Again, some of you were present. We had a short discussion of this on the markup mailing list recently, and we are now inclined toward a new solution, which would basically employ the TEI attribute corresp in order to tag or to encode the script in which a particular segment of an inscription is written, because we do not want to associate script with a language. We do not want to use the attribute XML-lang for encoding script. In addition to encoding things like that, we at least in some subcorpora, we want to, for example, resolve abbreviations, and we want to start adding semantic information to the text, for example, by tagging names, in certain text tagging rows and measures, and to tag certain specific lexical items that are relevant to the study of South and Southeast Asian inscriptions in general. And at this point, I'll pass the mic back to Arlo.
Thank you, Daniel.
Yeah.
So, still on this topic of adding value to our, let's say, the individual texts in our corpus and to the corpus as a whole, it's really important to keep in mind that what sort of binds our corpus together is the role in the foreground or in the background of Sanskrit and various cultural practices typically expressed in Sanskrit. And one of the features of this role of Sanskrit is heavy infiltration of vernacular languages by Sanskrit vocabulary, much in the same way as European languages have been infiltrated by Greek and Latin vocabulary. And this is very particularly the case of the technical terminology that is relevant to the project's central research questions. So this interlinguistic aspect raises challenges to the findability of the relevant data. And some of the more noticeable obstacles to this findability lie in the morphological and orthographical features of the borrowing languages. To take an example, the Sanskrit legal term gunadosha, which means virtue and vice, figures in Old Javanese inscriptional and non-inscriptional sources, for instance, with an infix to get gumunadosha, meaning to judge what is good or bad, the work of a judge. And on top of that, so this infix, which sort of hides the, for the the person not familiar with Old Javanese grammar, hides the Sanskrit origin of the term. The job might be made even worse by a wide range of spelling options that we find in the documents. So to solve, to make such terminological data findable, we need to link individual instances to a interlinguistically common lemma, which will in most cases be a Sanskrit lemma. But there are challenges to such lemmatization, which come mainly from the important phenomena of sandhi, which is a feature of the Sanskrit tradition, which has also been borrowed into vernacular writing traditions. There's an example on the top right, the short phrase rajnaiva veha sahagataha, which actually, although it looks like two words, in original documents there wouldn't be any spacing, so it would look like a single word. But even if we use editorial spacing, we can only get it to look like two words, although in fact it consists of five. Rajna, Eva, Iha, Saha, Agataha. Partly for reasons of this this very challenging aspect of how the writing system works, we don't plan any global lemmatization of the corpus. Although we do intend to try to find solutions for this more limited lemmatization that we would need for technical terms. So we won't have lemmatization, and yet we ideally need two search methods. First, lenient search to gather fuzzy results and to tolerate variations in epigraphic spelling without returning too many false positives for a query. And we also, on the other hand, we need to have a strict search to return the exact string searched for. Now, delivering these needs is work in progress. And now I turn to the chapter of managing metadata. And I see that we're already grossly over time, so I too will be forced to go fast, but I'll nevertheless try to present every slide. We're managing bibliographic data, I'm inclined to say, of course, in Zotero. We've written a rather extensive Zotero guide to somewhat streamline the manner in which people might enter bibliographic data and hence how they might be displayed. Every item has an identifier declared in the Zotero short title field. We use an automated script in Python to move short titles into the tags section through Zotero API. We retrieve the bibliographic data with XSLT through Zotero API call. And we deliver several formats depending on the context and usage. And we use schematron validation of this Zotero short title in XML with Zotero API, which gives an error message if a Zotero short title is non-existent or exists more than once. We use a variety of storage platforms, the well-known service GitHub, but also 3 types of storage provided by the Très Grande Infrastructure pour la Recherche of the French government, called Humanum. Specifically, our XML data and project documentation are stored in GitHub, images and PDFs for project internal usage on a service called ShareDocs, archives and heavy files in a service called Humanum Box, and heavy image files to be disseminated through the service Nakala. We've developed an epigraphic ontology, which works with 4 basic entities: the inscription as text, the text-bearing artifact, any surrogates, and digital images, whether of artifacts or of surrogates. Our workflow for managing metadata is rather complicated, but you see here that we use spreadsheets for the text, artifact, surrogate, and digital image entities. We use a system called OpenTheso for controlled vocabularies. We will try to use the Pleiades gazetteer for managing spatial data. We separate various types of metadata, whether they can be handled in XML RDF files or in the TEI headers of editions. We will disseminate on a website that I'll come to speak about and through linked to this Nakala service that I've mentioned. Our management of metadata in spreadsheet, that's well, the result of a long thinking process, and we haven't really, well, we've tried to find other solutions, but found that probably the use of spreadsheets is the most suitable for our needs. So metadata to be organized in very complicated spreadsheets and then redispatched from those spreadsheets to RDF or XML. We manage controlled vocabularies in 3 types or parts. A thesaurus managed in OpenTheso to register and organize scientific concepts. Our aim really is to create an international referential to describe our material that can also be used in other projects. We will also work with closed lists of terms to describe more specific aspects of our material, such as condition of an artifact or surrogate, and let's say a REST category that we intend to manage with keywords, free choice to be gathered and made coherent at a later stage. Just an example of this open source software, OpenTheso, where concepts can be organized in a thesaurus in multilingually, so we can have English, French, Indonesian, other language concepts. We can link them to Wikimedia. We get identifiers, as you see there, the URI, which we can use in our data management. We've already developed controlled vocabularies for text description, such as text type and subtype, languages, script type and subtype, script maturity. I won't go into details on that here. Writing technique, and we use these keywords. And as Dániel just hinted at, we'll manage the appearance of multiple script language combinations on a single support on the containing elements using both XML, lang, and either CoreResp or rendition. We're still discussing that. Here is just an excerpt of the artifact part of our data model. And let's quickly move to the next slide for an example of why really we needed to develop our own controlled vocabulary, because existing vocabularies don't serve our material well enough. Example here, it's rather small, but it's the term miniature stupa, which is really an epigraphic support, quite particular to our part of the world. And this is almost our last slide. So we're trying to bring all these metadata and text data together eventually in an online database, which, well, we've reserved several domain names. The basic name will be Dharma Leka, which means Dharma writing in Sanskrit. One of the domains we've reserved is the EU suffix, where all our XML data will be delivered through ExistDB, hosted on this service Humanum that I've mentioned, where we will enable faceted search on metadata, if everything goes well, fuzzy and non-fuzzy search on textual data, linked to an image library, and in interaction with the Pleiades gazetteer. And that brings us to the end of our presentation.
Thank you so much, both. This was, I mean, for me, a very fascinating journey, and so many things that I didn't know. And I have some questions, but before that, I want to do two things. And one is warmly inviting all the people that are following this on YouTube, if you have any questions and comments for our speakers, to just post them on the YouTube chat, and we will bring them into this conversation. And the other is actually asking Gabby first if he has any comments or questions, because I don't feel like saying anything about TEI or Epidoc before I've let him.
If you like, I can ask a brief question first. Sure. So thank you both very much. That was a really thorough introduction to a project. Although I have met this project before, obviously, I learned a lot nevertheless. I had a question, a slightly conceptual question, by which I mean I'm not sure whether or not there's an answer, I guess, related to Daniel's point about transliteration and the choice of Latin as a transliteration language. Obviously, from a technical point of view, that sounds very obvious. One might have a little discomfort with that from a colonial point of view, of having made that decision. And I just wonder, not wanting necessarily to challenge that question, but to I wonder if that sparks the question of who is the audience for your digital editions. Is it mostly English-speaking, European language-speaking, European tradition scholars, or do you have an audience also of both scholars and perhaps interested public in other parts of the world, in particular in the parts of the world that the objects you're describing are from? And does that impact on the decision of how to, not necessarily how to encode it underneath, but how to publish and how to, the different forms in which you will disseminate this information?
Yeah, that I think is a very good question, and perhaps Arlo has more to say about it. I would just quickly like to say that indeed, yes, of course, transliteration and the practice of transliteration at all does have its colonial background. I think it should be okay to use transliteration without that kind of baggage because of its obvious advantages. Indeed, I think that at least at this stage, our primary audience is scholars, which means that even scholars in the areas which we are studying do at least have some familiarity with the modern world language and with the English script or Latin script, even if not our particular flavor of transliteration. Nevertheless, we do want to target interested layman or semi-layman, and although we haven't made many steps, I think at least in the Tamil section of our text, there has already been some investigation of how our editions could be auto-converted into display in a modern regional script, and we very much hope that we can manage that by the end of our project. I must say that as far as the standard transliteration systems are concerned, very good automated conversions routines do exist. Anytime you can just copy and paste text in Romanised transliteration into a web service, and you will get it in Devanagari or Tamil or Telugu or whatever script. I'm not sure if such conversion exists for Southeast Asian languages, but one could be written without very much difficulty. And the main problem is how to handle the interference from our markup and editorial spacing and editorial hyphenation when you want to use that kind of automated transformation to a different script. But the worst thing that can happen is that the transformed version of the text would simply lack that kind of finesse.
Yeah, sorry. I don't have a tremendous amount to add to that, but maybe a few small points. The part of the world that we're talking about has a very variegated history, and let's say in terms of script, various countries have moved very much. Script and language have very much moved in their own way. So let's say in Cambodia, there would be nothing more natural than to present a text, whether in Sanskrit or Khmer or any language, in the local script, which is perfectly capable of rendering almost all of our texts. But on the other hand, in Indonesia, virtually nobody can read the scripts anymore that were still practiced less than a century ago. And so there's this very checkered history. India itself has multiple scripts and languages, and there's also great resistance in parts of India to use of whatever the other script is, and in India precisely using, let's say, English script, as they call it, is precisely a neutral thing. So we can't turn back the clock of time, and it's just a fact that English script has, Roman script has colonized the world, and let us make the best of that fact. And certainly dissemination will be intended also for a broader audience than only international scholarship, but it's really a fundamental point for our project to try to transcend national boundaries. And even though there's a heavy post-colonial burden of let's say, extreme sort of focus on national data, to the complete ignorance of whatever was happening in parts of in neighboring countries, which until 100 years ago were, well, maybe just the same country, or anyhow, so all those national boundaries have no historical value and disturb the reception of historical material to an enormous degree. And it's our contribution to try to counter that. And nevertheless, we can, because all of our data will be, of course, completely open. And if anybody wants to take our data and then present them in whatever script they like, let them do so.
Okay, so I actually have a question that is maybe not strictly about text, but it's more about places and place names. And you mentioned the encoding of places, and you said that you are using or planning to use the Pleiades gazetteer, which was a slight surprise for me because I didn't know that Pleiades had sufficient coverage for that area of the word. And I was wondering if your project has actually contributed to expanding Pleiades, or if you are planning to use, the place names that you are extracting from the epigraphies to, basically then implement Pleiades and make the life easier for all your colleagues in the future.
So the answer is basically the latter. I've been in contact for more than a decade now with Tom Elliott, and he's been very eager to expand the scope of Pleiades in the Asian direction. but at the moment, indeed, there isn't much. So what we need, I forget now what the Pleiades internal terms are, but basically we have, let's say, geographic data related to our artifacts. So let's say modern data. We need a system for managing them. And then, of course, we have lots of toponymic data from our original texts. And we also, at least some parts of our project might be, are interested in analyzing them. So we haven't gone very far yet, I should say. But some of the PhD students involved in our project are hoping to work specifically on the modeling of geographic data. And I'm hoping that we will get lots of stimulus from them to show us the way to develop methods that will also work. But I think it's basically applying methods already existing in Epidoc and then harvesting those data and in absorbing them into Pleiades. So I think all of these things are relatively straightforward, yet they need to be done.
That sounds terrific. I mean, also, I mean, thinking of that linguistic variety that you described. So I imagine, how many variant, names and spelling of the names there are, going from one language or vernacular or, dialect to another. So I imagine it has a very, very rich kind of, here.
Many complications, of course, and probably, let's say, toponymic homonyms and an inability to distinguish things that might be two entities from things that are a single entity, and much less control of, let's say, non-epigraphic sources than I imagine you find for certain parts of the, let's say, Mediterranean ancient world.
Oh. I think that our audience might have been slightly intimidated by the unusual topic, but I'm sure that they are, still following eagerly. Do you have any other question, Gabby? Okay, then can I have a last one? I was really really fascinated by let's say the material culture aspect of some of the things that you showed, in particular those copperplate inscriptions bound together. I found them amazing, and I was wondering if you have found a lot of a lot of differences in the, let's say, in the material culture compared to the Mediterranean cultures, like the ways in which the inscriptions were written on the stone, or the ways in which they were produced. Any really remarkable difference that it looks like the same object, but it's actually produced in a complete different way. Have you met some of these examples, or they are actually relatively similar?
Mm-hmm. Do you have a good answer to that, Arlo?
Not a very good answer, but let me try to improvise something, and then you can fill in. So, as you've understood, such questions are not our research questions, but of course we are aiming to. I mean, we are of course all very much interested in such questions. None of us has, I think, much or any experience with really the artifactual aspects or even the textual aspects of Greek and Latin epigraphy. But so we are definitely trying to deliver metadata and images of equality and diversity and number that would invite comparative questions. And we are asking ourselves, I mean, even, of course, within our research area, sorry, I have to chase away my son. Within our rather large remit, but certainly hoping that this could stimulate or lead to comparative questions. And I should say that in general, I always feel, that we have very little information, let's say, about agents, involved in the production of our artifact in the text, even just inferring from the artifacts without having any historical data, but inferring how artifacts were produced. Well, it requires, let's say, direct access to artifacts. It requires the involvement of people with, let's say, the technical knowledge to even ask questions like that, or rather answer questions like that, and with the techniques that one would need to use to answer such questions. But yeah, I think that is sort of as far as I can go for my improvisation. Maybe Dániel can do more.
Yeah, I'm of course terribly ignorant of the Western world, but as concerns the epigraphic habit, there are two things that come to mind, which I think are quite conspicuous differences if you look at India. One is the ubiquity of religion. There's hardly an inscription that does not have a religious aspect. And the other one is that, as far as I can tell, funerary inscriptions are very widespread and very basic in the Mediterranean world, whereas they are practically non-existent in India, for the simple reason that they did not normally practice funeral, they practiced cremation. And so the closest you might get to a funerary inscription are what we call hero memorials and sati memorials, sati being a widow who committed ritual suicide after the death of her husband. So these are the closest we have to funerary inscriptions.
Okay, no, thank you. Yeah, sorry, I challenged you from the nuns that, Gabby is coming back to text now.
No, on the contrary, actually, I have another question about materiality and physicality of the objects. Now, I wonder what approach you've taken to making explicit some of the physical features of your objects. You talked about some of the fairly challenging objects you found, some such as objects that are still in the process of being degraded, objects that are very hard to see because they're a small part of a much larger monument, perhaps in reuse, those objects that are portable, and it seems to me that in certainly in the epigraphic traditions that I'm familiar with, people have often had the temptation to say, here's a photograph, so now you know everything there is to know about the physicality of the object, and I'm just going to talk about the text from now on, and that's clearly not enough. I mean, even if that were a 3D model, that still wouldn't necessarily be enough. You want to be able to describe the object. You want to be able to give detailed information about material, information about the layout of the text on the surface is something that you sometimes need to be able to say a bit more about than just showing a photograph. And I wondered if you'd encountered those same issues and what strategies you'd had for that.
Dániel, shall I?
Please do, yeah.
So most of this to be managed through our metadata, and so I would imagine rather conventionally, so some of the data organized in controlled vocabularies, other parts of the data in sort of free text. So for instance, for writing techniques, we've definitely given thought to things that have certainly never been or hardly been discussed, and certainly not in a way that would now be searchable, but let's say whether an inscription is engraved, or we also have some inscriptions that are in relief. We have inscriptions that are stamped, positive, negative polarity issues. We have, what other things can I, well, we have a rare, I mean, normally we are left to right and top to bottom, but there are cases of other writing directions. We have different dispositions of text on artifacts. So we are trying to put in place a system that can accommodate a very frighteningly broad range of such such issues, although of course not the whole, or at least not the whole in another way than describing in free text. And then the problem is sort of, as Daniel also hinted at some stage, that let's say there's a lot that we would like to be able to say and that we need to be able to say, but then of course, if we're then going to really say all those things about all our artifacts, that we'd be busy for decades. So probably our data set will be a mixed bag of some artifacts described with uncommon thoroughness and others probably not as sort of bare bones as you just said, but there, yeah, it might be rather undetailed in other instances.
Cool. So I would like to bring in a question from the audience. Oh, thank you, Gabby. So Francesca is asking, hello, thank you for your presentation. I have a question about the encoding of the type of scripts. How do you use the controlled vocabulary? And yes, she says that she deals with languages of ancient Italy and has similar problems. Do you have any advice?
So maybe I can give the start and then give the floor to Daniel. So there was some discussion on the markup list a number of months ago. Epidoc practice, as represented at least by Gabby, is to use well, the language to the left of the hyphen in the XML lang tag, and let's say if you have I guess LA for Latin and then hyphen LATN, or maybe rather GR or whatever the tag for Greek is. The conventional understanding would be that that is Latin in Greek script in the original document. Many voices, including our own TEI consultant in the project, oppose that practice because it is said that the script suffix should represent what is the script of the edition, which in our case is LATN for Latin. So basically, we want to keep what seems to be, despite Gabby's approach, the sort of more general TEI opinion, and use language with the ISO 693 tags to the left, always Latin in our case for the script suffix, and then we need another device to represent that a given chunk of text is in another script. And there we have actually two controlled vocabularies, which were set up quite recently, and Daniel played an important role, so I'll leave the floor to him now to explain the rest.
So basically what we're trying to do is, of course, there's an immense continuum, a spectrum of scripts being used. For example, I mean, I'm working on a pretty small subcorpus right now, the Eastern Chalukya dynasty, which occupied a geographically fairly small area for a fairly long time in South India. And going through their copper plate inscriptions, I can see a gradual change in their scripts, and there's no way to quantize that gradual change and say that, okay, the 6th century inscription is, let's say, a South Indian late Brahmi, but their 9th century inscription is Proto-Kannada, and their 12th century inscription is mature Kannada, and then there's no point in doing that sort of thing. So what we did for the controlled vocabulary was introduce, on the one hand, a very broad typology, which just follows the classical division of Brahmi into northern and southern styles, to which we added a Southeast Asian flavor of Brahmi. And in addition to this very broad classification, which basically contains just a couple of easily recognizable particular scripts in addition to these broad categories. So we have script classification on the one hand, and we set up a separate vocabulary for script maturity, as we call it, which basically assigns a sort of rough time bracket, or even more, not quite a time bracket, but a sort of a phase bracket of how far it has progressed from early Brahmi. And we use a combination of these two to describe any script, which of course means that there are going to be a number of in some cases, quite dissimilar scripts which get the same two labels. Both would be, let's say, early vernacular type of South Asian Brahmi, but it would still be a classification that is usable, and usable not only on the side of the person who is trying to encode this and looking at a particular inscription, classify the script of it, but also usable to the end user of a database. Because if we had 200 different script classes in our database, then not only would it be impossible for an encoder to do that objectively and assign any particular script to one of those 200, but it would also be useless for the end user. So I'm not sure if these two things together answer the question, but so on the encoding side, we'll probably stick with the attribute corresp, and on the controlled vocabulary side, we use this combination of two fairly limited vocabularies for script style and script maturity.
Cool. Thank you. And I think that we can close our discussion with Francesca. And I would like to thank Arlo and Dániel for an incredibly fascinating presentation and a very interesting discussion. And thank you, the people that followed from the audience. And I would like to remind that our next Digital Classicist seminar is going to be on June the 25th at the same time, and our speakers will be Chiara Palladino and Tariq Youssef, that are going to talk about we want to learn all languages, application of translation alignment in digital environments. So thank you, everyone, and have a lovely weekend, and see you next time.
And thank you, Valeria and Gabi, for providing us with this opportunity.